Hello, Garland Nixon here with Professor Nicolai Petro, and we're going to discuss what's happening regarding the peace process. I guess we can call it that, the negotiations, etc., between the U.S. and Ukraine. Excuse me, U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Professor Nicolai Petro. We've been working for years. I've been talking with him, discussing the Ukraine peace process for years, long before there was any thought of a path to peace. And I will say this: Professor Petro always kept a positive attitude and always said, well, the reality, every war ends sooner or later. They even had the 100-year war, but it was 100 years. At some point, 100 years was up and the war was over. And the discussion, of course, is always how it ends. Well, guess what? Historically speaking, every war ends with negotiations, even if it's only an unconditional surrender. Someone has to say, will you do an unconditional surrender? And the other person has to say yes and sign it. You can even call that a negotiation. So, Dr. Petro, phone call between, okay, let's start here. The phone call between Presidents Putin and Trump. The immediate reaction I got from a lot of pundits, etc., was that was nothing burger, nothing happened. It was completely irrelevant. It was a waste of breath. What is your take on it?
I think it's one more brick in the building of some sort of new world order. And it's interesting that Russia and the United States are contributing to the building of that order, along, I think, with the rest of the BRICS nations, and who is being left out of building this new world order that I think is an interesting and going to be a very substantial and solid construction, is mostly Europe. They're being left out.
Well, the one thing that I felt, if there was anything that I took of that, because I felt like all along, here's what we know. Russia has some, we could call them red lines, some demands that they're not going to back down on. There's probably a few that they say they're not going to back down on that they could play with a little bit, but there's some they're absolutely not going to back down on. But one thing that I thought was said towards the end that I thought was consequential, and it's relative to what you just said, they will continue with bilateral discussion. Now, the more they talk, the more they say bilateral, the more they make it clear Europe is not part of this conversation. They're not going to be a part of the conversation. And my thought is this: in the real world, I mean, we can be nice and fluffy. In the real world of geopolitical power, if you don't have military power, you don't have economic power, you're really not in the conversation, because you can't force anybody's hand on anything in the real world of countries negotiating. It may seem kind of cold, but your thoughts?
I would add two other things to that list. I would add a population that is substantial, that can be used in a variety of ways. It can be a labor force. It can be used to serve as an armed force. These are commodities. People are important commodities in the construction of power. And another component of real power is resources. Who has them and who doesn't? And like it or not, Russia has been blessed with the world's greatest accumulation of resources. The resources that they've been able to tap are only the tip of the iceberg. it's hard to even imagine what the value is of the resources that are yet to be discovered and brought into the economic powerhouse of Russia that lie in central and eastern Siberia.
Yeah, as I think that one of the things that, if you could comment on this, one of the things that this conflict has done, over this kind of neoliberal era in the West, the discussion was money and capital, right? And it was, okay, well, we can just make derivatives and things like that, and we can create money and capital out of black magic, right?
Yeah.
But, and there was a discussion like that was all the power, we have capital. I think this conflict has brought the world back to a reality. You know what? If you've got timber and gold and titanium, back to a world that real power, magical financial tools that are created on Wall Street give you fake money.
So
But anyway, go ahead.
I noticed that Russian economists more than a decade ago started to use a phrase that made me think about what exactly they meant. They spoke about the real economy. So what was in the real economy? And that's not a phrase that you see used very often in political economy circles in the West. There seems to be a little bit of attention focused on goods, manufacturing, extraction of resources, and how that all fits in. But let's face it, the wealth of the West is in pushing around money from one bank account to another bank account to another investment account. Very little is actually produced. The wealth that we create that way is largely on paper, and we don't actually know what it actually would amount to if it ever needed to be sold in large quantities. It's more of a speculative prediction about the future of the economy. So one of the things that Russia has focused on in the past few decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union is making sure that it has a real industrial base and has a manufacturing capacity of its own that is not dependent on other countries. And other European countries and the United States are just now beginning to catch on to the importance of that. There used to be a time when we talked disparagingly, politicians even talked disparagingly, about the Rust Belt, the old economy. And now what are we doing? We're paying people who are not college graduates, but have gone to technical college or even a community college and obtained technical degrees and are skilled laborers. We're paying them more than junior PhDs, than freshly minted PhDs at some place, because that's where the real demand is.
Well, and then the other part we're seeing it is, and this is just an example of it, an expression of it, the capacity of Russia's, like I said, all of these things are the lessons that we are relearning as a result of the Ukrainian conflict. The ability to have industrial capacity, and that to me includes both. You've got to have the factories, but Russia has steel mills. You've got to have the things that go into the factories to make a tank, but then you've got to have the population and the people that are educated. And the one thing we can say for the Soviet Union, what did it create? It created a lot of very well educated people, right? So as Europe says, we're going to put out 800 billion or $1 trillion and rebuild those elemental rudimentary things that are necessary to have a powerful industrial base. Some of those, you got to have all of them. You know what I mean? And Russia's been, I don't know, blessed, lucky, culturally, whatever. But you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I know. I was very amused before his untimely death. I listened to Steve Cohen,
Yes.
the noted Russia specialist, and he was in this debate with this economist about resources, and he wittily made the comment that your argument is not with Russians. He said to his opponent, your argument is with God. that he placed all of these resources at Russia's disposal, and they're smart enough to use them and build power on the basis of that. Russia, because of its geography, because of its expanse, because of the resources and territory that it has been able to accumulate, and also because of the ingenuity and skills of its people, is at the crossroads of the world. It is the heartland of Eurasia. And since the time of Arthur Thayer Mahan, there has been a school of geopolitics in the United States that has pointed out that the future of the world will be determined by who controls the heartland of Eurasia. And that's where Russia is. That is Russia itself.
Yeah, and so ultimately, what we come down to is a reality where, actually, something popped into my mind that I want to discuss. Okay, as Russia gets, adds more territory from Ukraine, right? They add eastern Ukraine, and as you know, over the course of time, that area of the world, those borders, Ukraine particularly, have moved all over creation for centuries, right? The thing that's not being talked about is this. The areas of Ukraine are, they're getting ports. They're getting areas where grain is grown. They're getting, you know what I mean? They're getting areas that are rich in resources and people and industrial capacity. So as its conflict ends in Russia, for certainly for security reasons, aren't giving those up. The other part of it is Russia's going to be extremely more wealthy and powerful and have greater economic capacity.
Well, the eastern part of Ukraine that is currently under Russian control has historically been the industrial basin for Europe. It is one of the few places where the combination of metals, transportation, and sort of geographic rivers that are needed to cool down smelting plants have come together. And so it became very quickly, at the end of the 19th century, the industrial heartland for the production of iron ore and its derivatives. First of all, for Russia, but it was also where British and French investors invested a great deal because they could see the profit of it. So if the territorial conquests remain and the border remains where it is today, Russia will definitely benefit from the reintegration of those resources, which for a variety of reasons, some of them economically based, but some of them politically and culturally based, not wanting those regions, in other words, to become wealthy compared to the rest of Ukraine. For those reasons, the government in Kiev neglected these investments and instead opted to promote agriculture in the central part of Ukraine and to a lesser extent in the west, and to reconceptualize, and this is especially true under Poroshenko, President Poroshenko, tried to reorient the Ukrainian economy into some sort of post-industrial computer-driven artificial intelligence hub. I don't think Ukraine has any particular advantage in that area. It has a capable workforce, but the number of people that it can mobilize in those professions is not strikingly more than any other country. And here's the sticking point, I would say, for that sort of development of the Ukrainian economy. It is poor. It is a poor country. And as a result, you can have highly educated people, but the people, if there's no investment, if there's insufficient investment in this sort of endeavor, it can never really take off.
Okay. And so one of the things that I see is, as clearly there are investors, clearly there are interests looking post Ukraine. One of the things that President Trump is saying now is, well, we'll take over, it's from one thing to the next. Oh, your minerals. Oh, no, okay. Well, we'll take over your power plants. It seems to me that there is a move amongst a lot of people, a lot of entities. Now they're looking at Ukraine like, as if to say, well, we may not want to admit it, but the war is going to be over soon. And how can we get it? Like, people recognize how valuable Ukraine is. And now the wolves are coming around, the hyenas are coming around to get their share of the carcass, shall we say.
Yeah, that's probably an apt analogy. But Ukraine, two things stand in the way. One is short term and one is longer term of a renascent Ukraine. The short term is that a lot of effort and money will have to be invested by international investors in the stabilization of the Ukrainian economy. The blood has to stop flowing. And by that, I don't just mean the war itself. After the war, if restrictions on travel are lifted, the first thing that many people will want to do is leave, because they are not sure how long yet the peace will last. If they're very optimistic, maybe they'll stay. But if they're young and they look at the past several years, going back to at least 2014 and earlier, and they have young children, they might very well decide that making this transition now that they can is a risk that they should take if they're allowed to settle in a more advanced economy. And it'll be difficult to keep young, active, intelligent, well-educated people at home in Ukraine, much less try to get the people who have fled the country and are refugees or have some sort of temporary work status in Europe right now to come back. The numbers of people who have been surveyed and indicated that they are thinking of coming back, not necessarily are likely to come back, but are thinking of coming back, is relatively small, less than a third of those who are living there now. So that's a very big problem. But the longer term problem, which is reconciling the competing national identities in Ukraine. Unfortunately, competing. They don't need to compete. They could coexist. And I'm talking about the Ukrainian national majority, along with the Russian, Hungarian, Romanian, Polish, and other national minorities in Ukraine. They could coexist alongside each other, but not in the format that nationalists insist on, which is there's a famous Ukrainian phrase: which goes, "Remember, foreigner, that here the Ukrainian is master." Um, that's not a very that's not going to attract people to invest in Ukraine from any of its neighbors or from the rest of Europe.
Well, and that's the other part, there are a lot of people who have been, grabbed and of ethnic minorities thrown into the military, mistreated, etc. So I would think that for instance, let me say this, the Hungarians, I would think that the Hungarian government may want to either grab a piece of Hungary, bring their people home, or do something. Some may see a responsibility to the ethnicities of their country, of their society, to make sure that the oppression, which they undoubtedly many have suffered during the war, stops. And that's the oppression of minorities during the war and getting gang pressed into the military, etc. The effect that's going to have post-war.
The result of the current Ukrainian policies has been for the governments of Hungary and Slovakia, and as well as major opposition parties in Poland and Romania, to vote against further support for Ukraine and further support for the military effort. I think actual territorial seizures by other countries of Ukrainian territory is unlikely unless there is an actual collapse of central authority in Kiev, and then it is at least conceivable that some EU governments would step in on a humanitarian basis and argue that we need to send peacekeeping forces to these heavily populated, these regions that are heavily populated by minorities, in order to safeguard them. Whether that is temporary or long-term, et cetera. But this is all a worst-case scenario that I hope very much does not happen.
Now, the Trump administration, as we know, like the American empire, is trying to count its money right now. It's looking around saying, oh my gosh, we can't keep going. This is the way we're going. And they're trying to consolidate. Trump has made it clear, when this thing's over, they ain't getting another dime from us. I think the U.S. is trying to pull money from Europe. Okay. Who's going to want to invest in Ukraine, especially with the ultra-nationalist problem? There'll be internal scrambles. Yeah. Who want to end with Russia kind of taking what they want? Who want to take the rest of Ukraine on their ledger sheets? Even the EU. If the EU says, "Oh, great, we want Ukraine in the EU," do they really want? If they put Ukraine in the EU, and they're bringing them on their ledger sheets, and it will be the most expensive thing that the EU has done in quite a while.
No, I think that's an unrealistic prospect. What the EU will vote for is emergency funding for the survival of the Ukrainian government or this or that humanitarian project, but it will not be enough, and it will not be systematic, and it will result in further distortions of the political and economic incentives within Ukraine. The same thing that's been happening systematically in the country since 2014, that is now slowly being revealed by various investigative reporting on USAID and other international groups. I mean, USAID is just one component. We haven't been able to open the books at all on their counterparts from Western Europe and the EU in those countries. I mean, I'm sure exactly the same problems have arisen there. And we don't even have to wait for necessarily all of that information, because there are continuing claims made by Ukrainian opposition leaders, including, for example, the former president, Petro Poroshenko, that corruption is rampant, We know who the corrupt officials are. Most recently, he gave an interview to Die Welt, the German newspaper, warning of Zelensky's creeping dictatorship, a word he's used before with respect to this government. In other words, the knives are out, and I don't know if everyone knows where all the bodies are buried, but there are certainly a lot of bodies buried that can be pulled out to discredit pretty much anyone in Ukrainian politics, past, present, or future. The solution to this is the same thing, essentially, that happened in Spain many years, about 40 years after the end of their civil war, which was, as the political transition was occurring from the Falangist regime of Franco to the beginning of a political transition toward democracy under the king, Juan Carlos. The political parties assembled and decided to have a moratorium on digging up dirt from the past. They called it a pact of silence, about the past, because they figured, and I think wisely and correctly, that a generation was needed where people were not afraid to engage, capable people were not afraid to stay in the country for fear of being what they had done being discovered. These are very often capable people, capable administrators, capable businessmen, capable military leaders who associated and did things under the old regime. I'm talking about major crimes, but that could be thrown in their face, and they could be hounded and deprived of their wealth and their liberty. In order to prevent this sort of flight of capable people, Spain decided to put a hold on that and to revisit revisit these issues in the next generation when passions had settled. And I recommend that policy of the Spanish call it el pacto de olvido, which means the pact of forgetfulness. Would be a very wise policy for the Ukrainians to adopt as well.
I think you're right. I think it's going to be very difficult. At the rate, let me just say this. Listening to, reading the readouts from the phone call, I got be honest, my inclination in looking at it is to believe that the Russians are intentionally moving at, shall we say, a glacier-like pace with this. Maybe wrong. I may be wrong, but it seems to me, my immediate thought is, okay, I understand the Russian culture. I've worked around Russians for years. And I understand that they do have a legacy of being very bureaucratic. And I understand that President Putin is, in fact, an attorney. And I understand that Sergei Lavrov, I understand that they want things, they want their I's dotted and their T's crossed, and they're not going to do anything in a hurry, as opposed to Trump, who's do it now, do it now, do it now. But I also get the feeling that they also understand there has to be a certain reality on the ground supporting their positions. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. But lawyers who are writing treaties have a different job than politicians who are selling it or selling an idea. The politicians nowhere in the world are sticklers for either the truth or for the details. They're selling a dream. They're selling an image of themselves mostly. And if the product that they're selling makes them look good, that's all they need. So Putin is one of those rare political figures who has both the capacity and the statesmanship to worry about the implication of the details.
If I may add one more thing to that, here's the other part. You've got oftentimes politicians are worried about, will I lose my support at home? While Vladimir Putin does have that, whereas when you get 87% of the vote, that's a vote of confidence that says to you, the people trust me to make decisions. And that's something a lot of politicians, has to be taken into account, because Donald Trump is a whole different. Anyway, continue.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll see regarding Trump whether he wants to challenge the 2-term limit. I don't think if he does, he'll be successful. Right. And that makes him a lame duck president already. And that's interesting because I think that Trump is engaged now in catching up with and doing everything possible to set his legacy aright, to make his legacy not what it was from the first term, but leading forward into the future as someone who has set the United States on a fundamentally different trajectory, as he would see it, toward greatness that'll be manifested after he's gone. I mean, it's not coincidence that he thinks of himself as belonging, or hopes to become, an addition to Mount Rushmore. I mean, in those sorts of terms. Megalomaniacal, certainly, but at least he's thinking in those terms rather than as what can I do for 4 years without offending too many people so that I can do something better in the next 4 years. There's always the suspicion that there's really nothing there beyond what I can do to get along, or what compromises I can manage to achieve. Trump is not in that mold, and that is what feeds him, and I think inspires him, and I suspect the people around him as well. He's also an emotional person, and so when he answers questions, what do you care? Why are you trying to push a peace between Ukraine and Russia? He always, the first thing he says, and he does it very spontaneously, very instinctively, he says, I want the killing to end. I want the killing to end. He's, in that sense, he's the most peace-loving president that I can recall. Everyone else is, that we've heard talking about wars in the past, and this goes all the way back, I think, at least to George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush even, has been, well, all cards are on the table. We'll see. We have to consider, America's national interests. No, Trump's instinctive response is, good God, end the killing. Bizarrely, you might say, he has no problems with sending troops or military strikes to take out people. But there seems to be a threshold with him that if it's a real war with lots of people dying, he's very averse to that. Although I know obviously there's also a discrepancy there when we talk about the Middle East. The Middle East is one kettle of fish. Russia and Eastern Europe is something totally different. An inconsistency, clearly. But I think he's being sincere when he really wants this war to end, and not just, as many people think, for the profitability of peace, but also because he's offended by the scale of the deaths in this case.
So let me ask you this. I had a friend of mine was talking about the Russians in the Middle East. Why don't they do this and that and the other? And then why not Iran? And I said, wait a minute. My understanding of international geopolitics is this. First and foremost, President Putin has 150 million Russians that he's responsible for. And while he may feel bad about the Syrians, Iran, we could talk about that because certainly there's an alliance there, and that is a very important country, and they are working with Iran. As the president, First and foremost, President Putin has to account for the 150 million Russians and for the future security of his country. That being said, if you are President Putin and you are negotiating with Donald Trump and you see him breaking deals in the Middle East and doing things that are, as you said, that seem inconsistent, right? Does that affect the way that you negotiate with him?
It might, but it might not. And the reason it might not is if the leaders have a sense of personal loyalty to each other. If there is, as Margaret Thatcher once famously said about Gorbachev, this is a person, or was it Putin? It might have been both, actually. These are people that we can deal with and that we can trust to follow their word. If there is this sense that the two leaders trust each other, then they are more willing to tolerate the seeming inconsistencies in other areas. What would break the relationship for them is a violation of the word given to the other leader in personal negotiations. And those words are very meaningful. We don't know what they are. We almost never learn of what was actually said in the private negotiations, except through hearsay. But we do know from the memoirs of diplomats that this kind of personal relationship and personal pledge to the other person, that you can trust me on my word that I will do this, is considered binding and very important in getting things done.
I would also think this too, and here's another again, when you're talking about international geopolitics, the other reality is this: how bad do you need what I have? You know what I mean? For instance,
Yeah.
you have a deal with someone else, and number one, what is the power dynamic? Can they push back? You push back? How much do you fear them from a power dynamic? Number two, I have something that you really need. You got to be more honest with me. You have no choice because you really need something from me. And I think right now, instinctively, intuitively, we can all tell one thing. Donald Trump has plans, whatever they are, economic plans, world plans, whatever they are. We may disagree with them wholeheartedly or agree, whatever the case may be, but that he's not going to be able to execute any of those plans as long as he's got Ukraine hanging over his head, and he wants to get rid of that. What do you think about, what do you think that comes across? That's what comes across to me, that this thing is really getting in his way and he wants it out of the way because it's really screwing up whatever plans he has, turning towards that. Now, turning towards China, or does he want a new Yalta deal? Which you could argue various things, but to me, it seems obvious that this is a thorn in his side, a burr under his saddle to whatever the next step he wants.
Right. So there's two aspects, I think, for Trump that makes resolving this war a priority. One, I think, is the national debt, which he feels, of the United States, which is out of control and driven by factors that he can no longer, and we hear this from the former Fed officials as well, we don't know how sustainable this uncontrolled growth of the national debt is. And ultimately, we may have weapons, we may have many other things, but the only reason our standard of living so far is as high as it is because we're borrowing. We're borrowing essentially as much as the actual value that we contribute to the GDP. In other words, by my calculation, if individual Americans had to live on the means that they earned, on what they actually earned, rather than on what they can borrow, our national standard of living would realistically be half of what it is. In order to sustain that level of borrowing, the United States and the US dollar has to keep afloat, has to be seen as stable, reliable, and not threatened by imminent collapse or the withdrawal by major nations of their willingness to fund our debt and to buy our treasuries and debt obligations. So that's very important, and I think is part of the drive for the government efficiency and trying to cut the overall expenditures of government. The other point that he is worried about is how to more effectively and efficiently project American power. And in order to do that, he has to renegotiate and re-examine America's traditional alliances. Some of those alliances he feels America's getting a bad deal in, and has for a long time. That's NATO, essentially. NATO, and as a shield for European security, has to be covered by the Europeans. They have to be willing to defend themselves. We should stop spending our money to defend them, particularly when they don't pursue the interests that we would like to be able to pursue, and count on them to reliably do what we would like them to do. So if that burden sharing can be minimized, then the United States, along with national savings from reducing the debt, would have the resources to confront all of the challenges, or at least many of the challenges, that China is posing. But unless we can control those two things, I think from Trump's perspective, there will be no effective way to counter the growth of Chinese influence in the world.
And to be quite frank, I think it's too little too late already with China. But maybe. That being said, the other part of it is this, because that will stay in that part of the world, in fact. You know, the old saying, you know, alliances change, but neighbors don't. Yeah. The other part of it is this. The end of the conflict, we've talked about it a little bit, but Russia and China have one of the longest borders in the world. And it seems to me that there are those misled, I believe, that in the Trump sphere that think they can somehow do a reverse Nixon, you know, that we're going to befriend China, Russia against China, etc. And you've got the Russia-China odd kind of alliance where Russia's really good friends with both, and they kind of mitigate the enmity between China and India. Your thoughts on that little big triumvirate there? They're all BRICS. They're very important in the BRICS. The U.S. is always trying to reach in and grab India and pull them out. Now they're going to reach in. Your thoughts on how that dynamic changes when and if the Ukraine conflict gets resolved? Or does it change? Or do they get even closer? Does Russia and China get even closer? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't see, or at least I would say this, since the 2000s, since Putin has come to office, the Chinese-Russian relationship has grown closer and closer and closer. And the reason is definitely not historical and cultural, because Russia has always thought of itself primarily as a European country and a product of European culture. So the withdrawal of contacts by Europe, especially Western Europe, from Russia, has forced it reluctantly to reconsider its geostrategic position and to increase its friendship with China. What has resulted from this has been the discovery that Russia and China is an ideal match. They're made for each other because Russia has all the resources that China could ever want for its growing industrial capacity and population base to satisfy those needs. And meanwhile, China can export all the goods that Russia needs and could ever want to produce for a consumer market, to have for its consumer market. So this is as I said, a match made in heaven, a perfect synergy. There is nothing the United States or the Europeans could offer at this point to break that relationship. What the United States could do is to try to suggest that there are other lucrative deals to be made to Russia by the United States if they would partner in different areas, but not at the expense of a third party. That is geopolitical silliness at this point. To think that if you want to partner with us, you'll have to give up partnering with another country. That's precisely why the BRICS have grown so dramatically and become an ever increasing factor in international politics, because they don't play those games. They don't play the sanction games that the United States under previous administrations and the Europeans are still trying to impose, not just on Russia, but on China, on a number of other countries. The BRICS are fundamentally devoted to the idea that free trade should predominate, and nations that want to trade should trade with each other based on the mutual economic benefit, regardless of political conditions. And that's what makes them so attractive, and irresistibly, I would say, attractive to countries in the global South.
And I would add, particularly in light of the history that they have of dealing with colonial powers that did just the opposite. Now, what's interesting is watching President Trump now say, look, sanctions are bad for America. Sanctions are hurting America. They're going to hurt the dollar. To recognize that, to take ownership of that. But it seems to me that the U.S. foreign policy, for lack of a better word, they're hooked on sanctions. They're junkies. So while he can even say that as they continue to institute sanctions, your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I wrote more than a year ago about this addiction that you mentioned, sanctions addiction. There's a huge amount of confusion about sanctions, and that is promoted by the media. If you look at the scholarly literature on sanctions, it universally sees sanctions as a failure of political discourse and a failure in terms of its ability to condition the actions of other nations. It is a one-shot deal. If sanctions do succeed in certain very specific circumstances, it is because of the overwhelming economic disparity between the countries, including the fact that one country literally does not need anything from the other country that it considers vital. And secondly, it is the result of applying these sanctions to a country that is relatively isolated and small and can therefore be hit over the head before it actually realizes that survival in a sanctions regime is always possible, because the world economy is a much bigger place than the United States, which may be the country with which you've historically done business with, but it'll cost you to reorient that business to other customers. Russia doesn't fit any of those categories. And it was always foolish to assume that Russia would cave under the truly, I would say, rather insignificant impact that the the economic sanctions imposed by the United States and the West have had on the livelihood of average Russians. And we see that reiterated now over the past 3 years. There is literally no type of sanctions that one can imagine being imposed that would result in the capitulation on policy of an economy the size of Russia.
Right. And particularly when they have commodities and people need those, that people have to come to them. They don't have to sell things.
Right.
They have to offer them. People only have to know they're available, and people will come to them and say, I need what you have. And even if they're sanctioned, the people will say to the US, I know they're sanctioned, but the ramifications of your sanctions are far worse than the ramifications of not getting this particular titanium or whatever we need.
Right.
And the example is we violate our own sanctions. We have to buy stuff from them. That's how bad it is.
Right. And the price ceiling on oil that was imposed is meaningless. The price has never gone below that supposed ceiling of $65 per barrel. And as soon as Russia, the real test, and it was an interesting test, was when Russia was cut off from the SWIFT economic exchange, the banking exchange system. And Russia simply said, okay, if you want our commodities, you will have to pay for them. We don't have the mechanisms for doing so. Fine, then you will have to pay us in rubles, and you will open ruble accounts in your banks and transfer those rubles to us and accept whatever payment in exchange. And the payment will be up front for anything that you buy from us. And after a great deal of reluctance to do so, every major nation that is dependent on Russian energy sources has done exactly that.
The big pot of money that has been confiscated by Russia, that has been actually put the Europeans in a difficult position because they have it there, and now we'll take some of it. No, we'll take the interest. No, we'll take it all. Oh, well. And at some point, when this thing's over, or they're going to be in a position where they've got to give that money back, which I might be at is pretty humiliating. But if they don't, the Saudis, an example, have always said, you confiscate that money, we're taking our money out. Sure. Your thoughts on the eventuality of that huge pot of money that Russia has waiting to come home at some point?
Yes, you're right. The dangerous precedent that the confiscation of assets, of sovereign assets of other nations for whatever political whim a Western government might have is a very dangerous precedent that other nations will take into account. But that's not perhaps even the longer term problem. The longer term problem is that there is a court system in the West. And although those courts can be put under political pressure, that political pressure can change over time as governments change. But the laws don't. And Russia has the better part of international commercial law on its side. So whether Russia gets this money back within a year after the end of the conflict, 5 years, 10 years, or 25 years doesn't really matter. What matters is how Russia, the terms under which Russia will agree to a final settlement. Let's not forget that this is not the first time that Russian assets have been confiscated. The assets of the Russian imperial court and the Tsar were seized as well, because the Allies, after the Russian Revolution, didn't want to give those assets back, give them to the Soviet government. And the fight over them continued for decades. I'm not sure even that it has been formally negotiated in some countries. The official end even formally been negotiated in all countries, but became part of a larger and larger debt obligation that for which Russian debt, even in the 1990s, was exchanged for a liquidation of those demands from the beginning of the 20th century. So these problems, this damage that the Europeans have done to themselves in seizing these assets illegally will not go away. It will simply be inherited by future generations.
And there are those who argue that they've been dipping into that pot. Certainly, they've been taking some percentage of the the interest, which is a lot of money. Yeah. Still a lot of money. And go ahead.
Well, all of that is being calculated and tabulated by Russian government accountants. So there will be a reckoning under international law eventually. There's I think no escaping that reality. So knowing that, I'm sure Western governments have been prevented from doing what politicians would like to do by the sound counsel of their own lawyers.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was the U.S. just gave blobs of money to Ukraine. They claim some Lend-Lease stuff, or I don't believe that, but a number of the European countries allegedly, ostensibly, lent money to Ukraine.
Yes.
Ukraine's not going to be in position to pay that back for a long time, if ever. And might I add, at the close of this conflict, Ukraine is just living off of Western money, mostly American, that's paying everything. If that stops, I mean, you're looking at catastrophic economic consequences. Sure. Your thoughts on those two things?
I describe and try to simplify the dire Ukrainian debt situation in my book. So that's by the end of 2022. But as you point out, a significant part of European monies that have gone to Ukraine are loans. A portion of the American money, but not the majority, has also been loans. And that's added onto private equity companies that have funded the Ukrainian debt and bought assets also, which on loan terms that are due to be repaid over the next 40 years. Under the terms that were in place in 2022, Ukraine needed to start repaying that debt as soon as its economy grew at a 4% rate annually. And that would significantly have cut into its domestic GDP growth. All of these issues will have to be revisited once the conflict is over, but it's very hard to see what benefits Ukraine will derive, because certainly the private investors who have to repay their own shareholders, the lending corporations that have invested in Ukraine, will not want to give up those profits. The government might be able to negotiate a forgiveness deal. The Europeans might be able and willing to do some of that, but it all depends. And we're talking about truly astronomical sums that none of these Western countries and investors can really afford not to get this money back from Ukraine, which will largely be rebuilding rather than growing during the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be, their infrastructure, the electric plants and things that have been hit, and the transportation hubs that have been hit, and the gas hubs. All of those things are very expensive, and somebody's going to have to pay. And again, I think there's going to be a major refugee crisis.
Which is why I argued a couple of months ago that Russia needs to be part of this resettlement, of this economic investment program. There is no country in the world that is more interested in the well-being of Ukraine economically than Russia is, for cultural reasons, for geographical reasons. Now, the current Ukrainian government is dead set against this, but the monies that are needed simply cannot be conjured up without European investment, American investment, private investment, as well as investment from Russia. All of that together is needed for Ukraine to stabilize and eventually begin to prosper economically.
Yeah, I think that while, certainly Russia doesn't want to take all of Ukraine on its ledger sheets, but the other issue is this, it's kind of like having a crack house next door. Nobody wants a crack house next door because you got crime and all kind of terrible things that you have to deal with, and who wants a failed state on their door? A failed state on your door is going to cause you got to deal with that, those security issues and people trying to come over and steal and go back and forth. So Russia is going to be heavily invested in stabilizing Ukraine.
If allowed to do so. And frankly, I think encouraging it to do that on a mutually profitable basis between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government would be an important contribution to the final settlement arrangement that could only benefit both countries.
Such as this. Okay, the issue of Odessa. Okay, well, will the Russians take Odessa or not take Odessa? Well, what if there's some kind of, and I've heard this discussed, kind of ownership thing of Odessa?
February 20th, 2025.
Sorry about that. Wherein the Russians develop the port. There are a lot of Russian speakers there. They rebuild the port, develop the port. The Russians use the port. The Ukrainians, they've got the things, wheat and things like that need to go in, and grain go in and out of the port. And there's a kind of ownership and development of the port, which I think would be a good kind of thing anyway. Particularly, there's a lot of Russian speakers in Odessa anyway. But something like that, I think, would be. What do you think about that as an idea?
I think it's an interesting concept, but one that would be very difficult to sell to any Ukrainian government. It is true that historically, shortly after Odessa was founded, it was able to grow exponentially thanks to an arrangement that it had within the Russian Empire as a free port. And it became so prosperous by the end of the 19th century that it was known colloquially as the third capital. St. Petersburg being the first, Moscow the second, and Odessa the economic capital of the Russian Empire. Certainly, the people there would benefit. How and whether this could be sold politically and under what terms is difficult at this point to imagine. If it were ever to be part of the negotiations, I would imagine it would have to be some sort of sweetener toward the very end, sort of like providing massive international investment, including the possibility of Russian investment, as a way to anchor Odessa as a economic hub for development of the population and the economy of all of southern Ukraine.
Yeah, some kind of like a multinational port. You know what I mean?
Yes,
where
but
it,
under firm and clear Ukrainian jurisdiction.
right, exactly. But we got a long ways before we get there.
A long way. Yeah, a long
But
way.
I think all I would say is this: I think those are the creative kinds of things that you're going to have to consider, because this is not your average conflict where at the end, this is the border, and this was because of the cultural history, because of the influence from outside to empower the ultra nationalists. But in a way, the good thing is the ultra nationalists, they don't have the numbers
Right.
commensurate with their political power. And I think that's going to be their downfall in the long term. You know, they're
Well,
willing to use violence, but they don't have the actual numbers in the population commensurate with the political power that's
they
come
don't-
from the U.S. and Canada. Anyway, go ahead.
they don't have to rely on their numbers to get political power because they have weapons.
Right.
And until and unless the Ukrainian government is able to get them to disarm, they will be able to exert that inordinate power and be a check on common sense for the Ukrainian government, for any future Ukrainian government. It is as clear as day that what the Ukrainian government needs to do to assert its own legitimacy and political authority after the end of this conflict is to disarm the far right and establish the rule of law as equal for all throughout all of Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, I think you're right. I certainly agree with you. Well,
No
thank you very
special exceptions whatsoever.
Yeah, and as I think you and I may have discussed, last thing, that won't it come to a point where the Ukrainian military, if it collapses or whatever remnants are left of it, or if they're able before it collapses or falls in apart or into instability, where the Ukrainian military, the leaders of the Ukrainian military, whatever, will have to decide, where let's say at some point, what's his name, Zelensky's gone, there's a new government, and the government says, look, we got to get a deal. This thing is not working for us. We're falling apart. At some point, won't the Ukrainian military and its leaders, and even it could fall into parts, have to say, we're going with the new government, or we're just going to continue to fight it out and maintain instability and civil war? Aren't we going to come to that point at some point?
Well, we're delving into fantasy now. Because there are many ways in which an army can disintegrate, and there are many ways subsequent to an army's disintegration that a political authority can disintegrate. Ukrainian history has a number of examples of this, including what happened during the period from 1917 to 1919 with the collapse of the Russian Empire and the failure of the various military units that were no longer loyal to the Russian Imperial Army to consolidate, and as well their political respective political governments in the West and in the center were at each other's throats and betrayed each other's interests. That could certainly recur. But it's only one scenario and isn't necessarily the one that will happen. Let's hope that calmer and wiser heads will prevail, both in the Ukrainian military and in the Ukrainian political leadership, that will reach an accord well before disaster overwhelms them.
Dr. Nicolai Petro, where can people go to find all your work, your information, etc.?
www.npetro.net, my website.
Inpetro.net, that's where you can find all of Dr. Petro's work, and they can find links to get your books and stuff like that, correct? Yes. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to hopefully next week, if you got some time, we'll talk again, and I'm sure, well, I think are they supposed to meet Monday maybe? I'm sure there'll be more to talk about.
Very,
I'm sure
yeah.
there'll be more to talk about next week. Dr. Nicolai Petro, everyone, it is important because, you know, the let's just say the algorithms don't always work in our on our behalf. It's important that everyone who's watching this share this on all your social media platforms. These kinds of discussions, these kind of intellectual, philosophical discussions are very, very important. You know, what you get a lot is emotional discussions. A lot on, oh, I hate Trump. I love Trump. Oh, the Russians are evil. No, it's the Ukrainians are evil. And, you know, to get these kind of intellectual discussions are very, very important to give you another perspective. We're not just here, you know, I see people in the chat get mad and happy and all these things, but we're not here about, this is not about feeding people's emotions. This is about giving people a historical context and a deep understanding of how people who are negotiating and have a knowledge of negotiating look at these various issues. Share this on all your social media platforms. And of course, follow me on Rockfin, follow me on Rumble, follow me on Telegram, all that kind of stuff. And if you can afford to donate to the channel, there's Patreon, buy me a coffee, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't matter if you can or not. Even if you can't, you can share this on all your social media platforms and get the information out there. Thank you very much.